Rosebud. We're going to talk today about the greatest film ever made, Citizen Kane, and try to make sense of what makes Citizen Kane the best film ever, rather than just saying, oh, it's the greatest film and then stopping. I'd like to explore the real ideas that the film is trying to get into. It comes in 1941. It's the first film by Orson Welles, and really the only film that wasn't in some way damaged by his relationship to Hollywood. It's the first film where he's had an extraordinary budget to work on a film, really an unlimited budget. He could do whatever he wanted. And he also had Final Cut. So later in his life, he got Final Cut only by making films with a vastly reduced budget and on a shoestring budget. But in Citizen Kane, he was able to have a lot of money and he was able to have authority over the film. It's our ability, I think. What Citizen Kane shows is that it's our inability to recognize the satisfaction that the lost object provides that leads us toward accumulation, and this accumulation piles up a sense of dissatisfaction in us. And the film is really a critique of the way accumulation destroys us psychically. So it's fundamentally, I think, a critique of the psychic destruction that capitalism visits on us. You might say that it diagnoses the psychic structure that underlies capitalist society. So even though everyone is not as rich or successful as Charles Foster Kane, everyone who is a capitalist subject in some way is beset by the same psychic structure and problems that Charles Foster Kane has, which is why the film has such a resonance and has endured since 1941. The idea is that we accumulate precisely because we fail to recognize where our satisfaction lies, that our satisfaction is in what we don't have rather than what we can have. And I think once you get that, then you see both how Citizen Kane works and how capitalism works, and how you can have a different relationship to satisfaction, that a different relationship to satisfaction is possible. The film is really centered around this one object, Rosebud, and the whole film unfurls as a search for this object, which is a sled. And the sled stands in not for what Kane has, but for what he doesn't have. And the key point is that it's not like if he had the sled, he would have some complete satisfaction that he once had and subsequently lost. So the key idea of the film is not to think, oh, if he had just, his mom had kept him and hadn't given him over to Thatcher, he would be fine. No, that's not the idea at all. That's seeing the sled as another commodity, and that's how we shouldn't see the sled. The structure of the film is incredibly important. So it's structured around multiple failed attempts to understand the signifier that Charles Foster Kane speaks as he's dying, the signifier Rosebud. So you might even say that the film is an attempt to attach an object to the signifier. Is there an object that corresponds to the signifier? Yes, there is. But what does that object signify? That's the other question. So it's a film of subsequent failures rather than success, because for Welles, the point is that satisfaction lies in the failure rather than in the success. This is linked to the idea that it's absence rather than presence, it's failure rather than success, where our satisfaction lies. And we can see here the beginning of the film, Thompson is given this task to find out what Rosebud means, and he's not going to do it. So the film is just about Thompson's inability to find out what Rosebud means. Although we as spectators find out, it's nonetheless a film about our failure as well. And the point is not what one obtains, but how one fails. So fail in the correct way, that's what the film is getting at. And you might think of it in this way of process versus object, right? Like, so Wells is concerned about the process of trying and failing because he sees that's really where our satisfaction, our enjoyment lies, rather than in the pleasure of actually obtaining something. And he speaks, I think, very eloquently about this.
I suppose you can say that if somebody doesn't spread themselves too much, they can have a more solid and enduring and established success. And if that had been what I wanted, which it never has been, then I shouldn't have tried so many different things. But I've been always more interested in experiment than in accomplishment.
That's a great idea. I'm more interested in experiment than in accomplishment. And the film Citizen Kane, in a way, shows what Wells says about his own life, because it's a narrative of the inaccessibility of the object rather than the act of obtaining it. And Rosebud has this fascination for everyone within the diegetic reality of the film, precisely because it appears to hold the secret of Kane's desire. And this fascinates people. Like, what is the thing, what is the object that is the secret of someone's desire? If we can know that, we think we can know what that person, we can know something fundamental about that person. And that's what everyone in the film is gravitated toward. And we approach this object that triggers desire in the film in 7 different distinct paths. The first one is the first thing we see, the objective newsreel describing Kane's life, which is the greatest failure. So it's the one that doesn't get there at all. And I think this is Wells's commentary on the attempt to be objective and also about the news structure of the day. It doesn't get there. It doesn't get at this object. Then we go through a series of 6 other failures, and each of them takes its own particular approach, but doesn't get to the object. When it would get to the object, it veers to the side and doesn't fully get there. So the film was written by Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz, and Pauline Kael, the critic, has slandered Welles and said it's just Mankiewicz who made it. But and David Fincher has actually made a film which, in a certain way, ridicules Welles, which I think should be boycotted. So Welles and Mankiewicz both constructed the story of the film, and Greg Toland was the cinematographer, and Toland, I think, is really in large part, along with Welles, responsible for the look of the film, which is, I think, so much a key to its greatness. And Toland, who's here on the left in the background, Welles is in the foreground. Toland was Welles thinks, and I think most people thought at the same time, one of the great, maybe the greatest cameraman working in Hollywood at the time. And he wanted to work with Welles because he thought Welles was an original thinker, and he was drawn to that.
Toland was a technician who agreed with that, which is a fantastic thing. On the first day I arrived, I thought, after years of being a director in the theater, that the lights were set by the director, since they are in the theater. So I said, this is where it will be. Now let's move this light over here, and so on. I set the lights. Behind me, Toland was motioning to all the people, shut up, let him go ahead. And then balancing behind me without my knowing it, you see. I worked 5 days like that until somebody told me, and I realized what a terrible thing I'd been doing. And Toland was furious that I'd been told.
That's very interesting.
It's a great tribute to him, I think. And he said, you don't know what it means because you don't look at it from formula.
Toland is willing to go along with what Welles wants to do, and that's what makes this film so visually interesting. And I think it starts even with the opening shot. So we get this sign of no trespassing, which suggests that there's some secret inside that we're not going to have access to. And then the film goes up and penetrates the fence. So we get into the secret. So the film violates this no trespassing idea, but in the end, does it get to some secret of Kane? I think that's the real interesting point that the film is making. Each path that we see in the film, the different looks that we have from the different characters' perspective, appears like it's going to have the solution that will eliminate the mystery of Kane's desire, but each one fails. So we never get, from the perspective of any of the characters in the film, or from within the diegetic reality itself, no one gets Kane's desire. And I think that setting up the sled as this object, there are 4 possible ways of thinking about it. The first one would be, we can know what someone's desire is. It's for this sled. The second would be more Freudian. Kane desired to return to his youth and to his mother. He lacked his mother throughout his life, and this was a time of bliss for him, and that's what the sled represents. The third one could be that whatever the desire is, it's not confined to any object, because he doesn't find his desire in anything, but the sled represents a desire that goes beyond a thing. Even though it's a thing, it's standing for something else. And the fourth one, which is what I'm going to insist on, is that the sled objectifies Kane's desire for what was lost as lost. So it only has its desirability insofar as it's this lost object. Now, Wells, interestingly, calls Rosebud dollar book Freud and thinks it's the gimmick from the film I wish wasn't in there. He thinks it's a cheap gimmick. But I think this is a way of maybe misdirecting listeners, or maybe just even selling his own film short, because I think in a way Rosebud is integral to the genius of the film, because the point is what it stands for, that it stands for the object as lost, not as this object. It's only dollar book Freud if it's this object that represents his mother perfectly. And the point, I think, of the film is this radical inaccessibility of the lost object and how we relate to what is lost and thus inaccessible. Because if one happened to find it, so in the middle of the film, Kane's on his way to look at the warehouse and go through these old objects, and it's possible he would have found the sled. At that time, if he would found it, he gets sidetracked by Susan Alexander then. If he had found it, then the lost object would cease to be the lost object. It would have no value for him. So it's only insofar as it's lost that the object has this value of being the lost object. And this is why someone can say, right before the sled, Rosebud, gets thrown into the furnace, throw that junk in. Because it really, I think we're supposed to see that it really is just a piece of junk that embodies Kane's desire. And it gets tossed in, and as it burns away, I think as a spectator, you're supposed to grieve, and grieve in part because no one else is able to see it within the diegetic reality of the film. That you have a piece of information that no one in the film will ever be able to have. And so it forces us to confront also that there's no other that we can rely on within the filmic diegesis. So it's a very traumatic, I think, filmic ending for that reason, because most films give you figures to identify with within the film on the level of knowledge, and Kane doesn't give us that. So it's a lost object. It's desired because it's lost. That's the fundamental position that the sled Rosebud has in the film. And then I think the key to the critique of capitalism articulated by the film is that all the accumulation that Kane engages in is a result of his attempt to replace this lost object with actual objects. And he's trying to recover something lost, the idea of the absent object, with something present, and they always fail. Because when you have an actual object, it never is the object. And he fails to see the role that absence plays in his desire, and thus he's on this perpetual dissatisfying quest for the correct object, which he'll never find. And he accumulates this mass of crap. And that's kind of what the capitalist universe does to everybody. Everybody is stuck on this project of accumulating a bunch of stuff that has no value, because the only thing that would have value is what's missing. And as a capitalist subject, one is not hewed to what is missing. And that's the problem. Or you might say that accumulation is the refusal to accept the necessity of loss. That loss is fundamental for subjectivity, but accumulation is the attempt to recover what's been lost and replace it.
I've always seen it rather as a story, to be honest. Naturally, any story has got its implications, but I've seen it as a story. I'd like to know what your intentions were. Did you mean it as a social document or as a story?
I must confess to I must answer this in a way that I loathe. I must admit that it was intended consciously as a sort of social document, as an attack on the acquisitive society, and indeed on acquisition in general. But I didn't think that up and then try to find a story to match the idea.
Wells admits here, I think, really nicely, that it is a social document about the critique of the acquisitive society because it shows the way in which accumulation leads to misery precisely because no object will ever be the lost object, but every object will pretend to embody what the lost object had, and so that will entice the subject to desire it. There's this great sequence in Kane where Kane says, you know, Mr. Bernstein, if I hadn't been very rich, I might have been a really great man. Thatcher responds, what would you like to have been? And Kane says, everything you hate. And that is, he would have been someone not devoted to acquisition, devoted to the failure. And that's what Thatcher can't abide. And here we see the glee with which he combats Thatcher and what Thatcher embodies, but he could never fully overcome the ethic that centers Thatcher's whole existence. That is the ethic of capitalist society and acquisition. Kane says beautifully, I always gagged on the silver spoon. That the wealth in the film is shown as incredibly crippling rather than enabling. And I think this is the key idea.
But just if I feel strongly enough about something, I don't regard my career as something so precious that it must come before my convictions.
So what Wells himself is articulating in the film is the way in which the drive to acquire ends up destroying your life. And what's interesting is in Wells' own life, he sacrifices his success for his convictions. And I think this is a way in which Wells' own life runs in contrast to what happens to Kane in Citizen Kane. That so I think it's completely wrong to see a parallel between Wells and Kane. It's almost like they're reverse images of each other, Wells' own life and Kane's life. Now, another part of the film, which I think is really important and tied to it, what it's trying to say, are the incredible technological innovations in the film. And what's important is that Wells never just uses a technological innovation for its own sake. It's always there to signify an idea. And I'll just go through 6 of these, which I think are really important. So deep focus, or what's the same thing, depth of field, which means you can see everything within the image equally in focus. The wide angle lens, which distorts what we see within the visual field. The innovative lighting, the way he would use light different parts of the image and darken other parts in a way that people hadn't really done prior to him. The use of the tracking shot to focus on an object and to actually show how we're distant from the object even though we're following it the whole time. The use of visible ceilings to show that there's a limit on subjectivity, I think. And then finally, the unique transitions, the way he'll use lighting to make the transition to connect things that we see that would otherwise not be connected. So first of all, the deep focus, the use of deep focus or depth of field is a way to show a contrast between foreground and background, even though both remain in focus. So we see that there's a connection between these two different levels within the image that otherwise would seem disparate. Now let's look at perhaps the most famous deep focus scene in the history of cinema. This is when Thatcher is first coming to Kane's parents' house and is going to take him away, and he's in the background playing in the snow, and his parents are in the foreground deciding his future.
The bank's decision on all matters concerning...
I don't hold with signing my boy away to any bank as guardian.
I want you to stop all this nonsense,
The bank's
Jim.
decision on all matters concerning his education, his places of residence, and similar subjects is to be
The
final.
idea of a bank being the
I
guardian.
want you to stop all this nonsense, Jim.
We will assume full management of the Colorado load, of which I repeat, Mrs. Kane, you are the sole owner.
Where do I sign, Mr. Thatcher?
Right here, Mrs. Kane.
Larry, I'm asking you for the last time. Anybody'd think I hadn't been a good
The sum of
husband, a father.
$50,000 a year is to be paid to you and Mr. Kane as long as you both live, and thereafter to the survivor.
Well, let's hope it's all for the best.
What's crucial here is that Charles Foster Kane is the object of the scene. He's who's being talked about. But we can only see him through the background. Like, we can only see him between the other characters. And I think it's really important that Wells sets it up so that he's visible only between the parents and Thatcher the banker. So it's this incredible shot where we know what's crucial, and yet we're paying attention more to the foreground than to the background. So that what Wells is showing us is that really what's significant is not really what we're dealing with all the time. The other thing that Deep Focus does, it's a very democratic, egalitarian aesthetic. So it levels the playing field. It says nothing is more important than anything else within the image. And that idea is really important to Wells, and it's part of the critique of capitalist society that he's authoring in the film. Now, to turn to the wide-angle lens, what's interesting is that it shows, instead of the way in which we see the object in the background, the wide-angle lens actually shows the way in which desire distorts the entire image. So we see that we cannot have direct access to the object because of the lens itself, which I think is pretty incredible. We'll see here. I'm going to show you this in Susan Alexander's Attempted Suicide. This is the famous wide-angle lens from the film, wide-angle lens shot from the film. So the point here is that we never see a neutral visual field. Instead, we see one that's been shaped by our desire and by the desire of Susan Alexander. So we can only see the field in this distorted way, not straightforwardly and not directly. And this means that there's no object that's just there for us to desire. Instead, the object emerges through the distortion of our desiring. And we have to think in that way. And I think this is another way that Wells is bringing loss and lack into our understanding of desire and into the structure of the film. The lighting that Wells uses is always commenting on the significance of what the characters are doing and what's being said. Most famously in the opening, toward the opening of the film, when they're projecting the newsreel, we see an incredible use of backlighting, which suggests the unimportance of these different characters relative to what we're seeing. Or we could say that it's showing us the power of the anonymous social forces over these different individuals. And that's, I think, the basic idea of backlighting. But then I think when Charles Foster Kane comes up with his Declaration of Principles, this to me is the greatest use of lighting in the history of cinema, because of the way the lighting is making a commentary on what we're seeing within the scene, and is actually showing us how what's being said in the scene, the opposite is really true. And it's only through lighting that we get that. So let's take a look at that.
I've got to make the New York Enquirer as important to New York as the gas in that light.
What are you going to do, Charlie?
Declaration of Principles. Don't smile, Jedediah. Got it all written out. Declaration of Principles.
You don't want to make any promises, Mr. Kane, you don't want to keep.
These will be kept. I'll provide the people of this city with a daily paper that will tell all the news honestly. I will also provide
That's the second sentence you've started with I.
People are going to know who's responsible.
What's so fascinating about this scene is that when Kane is the most egotistical, the most, as Leland says, using the word I twice, he's claiming to, I'm going to be responsible. We don't see him. He gets out, he's unlit. He is in shadow. So the lighting stays on Bernstein and Leland, even at this moment when Kane is claiming he's going to be the one responsible. So I think what the film is nicely showing is that even though Kane is, of course, egotistical, he's completely overshadowed by the other and capitulates to the other throughout his life. And that's what we see even in the guise of egotism. And I think this scene to me shows this better than anything else in the film. And I think it's the most inventive use of lighting that I've ever seen. So we also get camera movements in order to show us how our desire functions. So the camera will often move following the object, but we'll see the way in which there's a break, so we never really get to the object itself. We can never obtain the object through the movement of the camera. Something always gets in the way for Wells, and in Citizen Kane especially. So we're moving up to go over the fence in the front of the mansion, but we never get there. As we're going up, then we cut to an image of the fence from the outside. So this is, to me, typical of the way that Wells uses camera movement, that we never get to the point where we think we're going to go with the movement of the camera. Now, interestingly, I think ceilings for Wells are used to show the role that limitation has in structuring our desires. So we see the limits on characters, and we can even see the way in which the status of characters and what they desire is structured within the film. So we have the low angle shot to show the characters thinking well of themselves, and oftentimes we'll have the ceiling showing how they're fundamentally limited in ways that they don't understand. So I think that's what this shot is, as a double function. It shows both how Kane is impressed with himself and how he's failed. This is a point of failure for him, and the ceiling represents the limit that he doesn't himself grasp. And finally, the way Wells uses the in-camera dissolve. So he creates a dissolve not through a special effect, but with the camera itself. And he does it through the way that he manipulates lighting. And his point in doing this is to show the way in which there's lack or loss within the image itself. That's what he wants to try to evince through this technique. All of these factors, I think, come together to make up the political power of the film. And Wells himself always celebrated those who refused to conform, especially to conform to the capitalist ethos, which is what Citizen Kane is condemning. And he said, has a lot of great lines about this, but he said, for instance, sentimental bourgeois morality makes me sick. I prefer courage to all the other virtues. And he said, I think it's corrupting to care about success, and nothing could be more vulgar than to care about posterity. And I think he articulates this nicely in the following.
Well, of all the things you've done, is there one of these fields in which you would like to be remembered, if that doesn't sound too pompous?
Well, it doesn't sound pompous, but I'm against posterity on principle. I think it's almost as vulgar as success.
For Wells, art is critique. Art is amassing a political power in a critical way to make an intervention. That's what he sees art as doing. Every artist, he says, has an obligation to criticize his own civilization. It's clearly and obviously the task of an artist of any ambition. So this critical of one's own civilization, one's own culture, is for him what the artist has to do. And he thinks the greatest danger for any artist is to find himself or herself in a comfortable position. It's his or her duty to look for and remain in the most uncomfortable position possible. And I think Wells nicely did this throughout his life. Wells would not have liked this claim, but I think he's the closest that a filmmaker has come to Shakespeare. Wells himself said, I really can't make a comparison between a movie maker and Shakespeare. No movie that will ever be made is worthy of being discussed in the same breath. I think we can talk about Citizen Kane right alongside Hamlet.